Hello, everyone. Rebecca and I just wanted to give a note of thanks to each and every one of you. We are so appreciative for everyone who has listened, is following us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, who has sent us notes of encouragement through email, text messages, or direct messages on Instagram. We could not do this podcast without you. Rebecca and I love the space that we're creating, making sure that there's even more room in the world to grieve and support one another and to create more spaces of love and belonging. This is, however, a passion project, and every dime that we put into this podcast comes right out of Rebecca and I's pocket. So, if you'd like to take a further step in supporting us, please head over to buymeacoffee.com/allthegriefpod and buy us a coffee. What we'll really use that money for is to support production costs for our podcast. Thank you again for everything that you do. Please remember to follow us on your favorite platform, share this with your friends and family, and engage with us over on our Instagram page, All the Grief Pod. We'll see you soon. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to All the Grief, a regular podcast for all those who have been touched by grief. We are your hosts. I am Rebecca Luttrell.
And I am Andrea Mathern. We are two friends, a therapist, and a social scientist, both highly sensitive fellow grievers here to share our hearts as we talk about all the grief.
Hi, Andrea.
Good morning.
How is your heart today?
Well, I just got back from travel from, a few days without my boys, all three of them, and without my dog. And I came home yesterday, and I know you and I have talked about this before, but I remember the season of when my dad passed. I know it was in May. I know it changed everything, like Mother's Day, and it changed my birthday. But for some reason, I thought it was in the middle of May, and it was yesterday. And I only know that because I have these sweet souls and memory keepers who texted me just hearts and just, I'm thinking of you and holding you in my heart today. And yeah, it's not my favorite day to remember, right? But I felt really loved and held by these individuals who took the time out of their day. We do not talk every day. These aren't folks that I'm in regular communication with. One, her mother passed about 2 months before my dad. And so she just remembers in the season of her own mother. And so before we went to bed last night, I'm totally going to lose it. I asked the boys, let's just take a moment and just remember abuelo. And you don't have to say anything out loud. Just say something to him. And one of my little boys whispers in my ear, I said, I wish you were here. And I just lost it. It was just, my heart feels super tender this morning. How is your heart?
It's hard to hear and not just feel right into the tenderness and the skin of my heart.
Thank you.
Love you. Yeah.
Love you.
Yeah. So this week, I'm running this group on Wild Edge of Sorrow, and we had such a sweet group meeting this week so the chapter we were on is Rituals of Renewal, something of Sorrow. And it was so powerful because it was everyone really sharing the longing for ritual that we didn't grow up with and the longing to have grown up in community in a way that we sort of lost in the creation of the United States and this culture. We don't grow up with just grandparents and grandchildren and everyone being together, how we sort of spread apart and we're independent, and a longing for something that we can't get back. And it was really powerful conversation, just tearful, heartfelt. And then it was beautiful because we all sort of transitioned into recognizing the things that are resourcing and sort of what we do have. And in the end, it was, coming up to this idea of dancing like you're a toddler and you dance and there's no music playing, or singing and not being good at singing, playing instruments and not being good at playing instruments, but just finding your way towards things that help continue to move your grief. And it just stayed with me all week this week, and I feel really tender and sort of open-hearted because of it.
That's so beautiful. What a beautiful group. I'm so glad that all of you are together. You and I have had conversations, and our listeners will get to hear a beautiful podcast sort of about ancestral grief, which feels so tied to that in the future. So today, it all feels so linked. We have an incredible guest. I am so excited. Today we have Warren Kozak. who is an author and journalist. He has written for television's most respected news anchors, including Ted Koppel, Charles Gibson, Diane Sawyer, and Aaron Brown. He was an on-air reporter for my favorite news source, NPR, and his writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Sun. Today, we are going to talk about Waving Goodbye, his latest book. This book is about how Warren thought he had prepared himself for the death of his wife. He knew he would feel sad, but had no idea that he would have to invent a new Warren. In his book, Kozak offers a compassionate roadmap for navigating the complexities of loss and finding light in the darkness. So without further ado, Warren, welcome to All the Grief podcast.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on. It's really my honor.
We are so grateful. Well, as we do, we'd like to check in with you as well. How is your heart today?
Hugely improved now that I'm talking to both of you, to be honest.
Oh,
Thank you.
Seriously, because my daughter lives in Brooklyn. I'm in New York City, but she stays over some nights. And she was with me last night and this morning. And we were talking about this. And I said, I had really been so pleased with how I had been able to move on. It's been 6 years since my wife, her mother, passed away, a little over. And I said, but since the book came out, I've had to deal with everything that is in the book, which makes sense, of course. And it has brought back a lot of those memories, a lot of the difficulties. Claire and I were talking about that this morning. And I have to say, I'm going to just repeat it again. Just, being able to talk with both of you, that's improved my heart considerably. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're so welcome. We will take that in and want to acknowledge that, just what you said, our grief moves in waves, 6 years and you feel in a better place. And then it can take a conversation, song on the radio, a little reference to a chapter in your book, that can bring us back. And I can only imagine the flooding of this, having read it and then talking about it. So we appreciate your generosity in being able to open your heart and be really vulnerable in everything that you wrote and in your willingness to talk about it. So we extend our gratitude to you as well. Well, to kick us off, one of the things that Rebecca and I, in sort of the immediate opening of the book, obviously you're talking about everything that you're going through as you're losing your wife, but one of the things that you explore is that you did look in other places for ways to understand your grief. So can you talk to us a little bit just about that process of trying to find guidance and solace and community? You went to mentors, you joined groups, you read books, and how that journey led you to writing this book.
Sure. And I think that's a really good place to start. Maybe the basic question is, why did I write it? And I will tell you, it's a book I never, ever expected to write. The reason I think I wrote it was that, and it was 5 years after Lisa passed away, I think I had a little perspective by then. I know I could not have written this in the first year or second year or third probably. But I remember that in that first year, it was just so hard. And I looked for any kind of, people brought books, I looked for other books, and none of them worked for me. That doesn't mean that they might not have worked for other people. But one of the problems was that most of the books I saw were written in a very academic style, psychologists, psychiatrists, grief counselors, and it was the kind of writing I had trouble with in college. What I didn't realize, and I write this in the book, during Lisa's illness, she was basically sick for 4 years. The last 2 years especially were particularly awful. And we spent a lot of time in hospitals. And I was with her in the hospital. Claire was finishing high school, about to go to college. And I also have a day job. And I was doing the day job next to Lisa. I'd be typing on my computer. And I could do everything. I could take care of her. I could deal with the doctors. I could do what I could do for Claire, although we probably didn't do enough. I think she was kind of abandoned in her senior year of high school. But I think I was doing a pretty good job at everything. And then what shocked me was right after Lisa died, my brain just went out to lunch. I lost my concentration. There was a great line in the Joan Didion book that I keep going back to. A friend of hers said, after a year, I could read headlines. Really resonated with me. So I decided after 5 years to put something together in the plainest English I could possibly come up with, for people who were in that initial phase. You can read it at different times too, but short chapters, it's not a long book. And I tell the story of what happened, what worked, what didn't work, And I did it for other people. Now, if you don't mind, I just thought of two more things.
Yeah.
I had a very wonderful friend named Elizabeth McCormick, who had the same birthday as mine, and she was exactly 30 years older. She was a former nun, and she was an educator. She was the head of a big Catholic girls' school here in New York. And shortly after Lisa died, a mutual friend had a small birthday party for us on our birthdays. I was turning, I think, 66 maybe, and Elizabeth was turning 96.
Wow.
And one of the people at the dinner said, "So Elizabeth, what have you learned in your 96 years?" And without missing a beat, Elizabeth said, "When you help others, you feel better about yourself." And that has always stayed with me. So I think that was behind it. And one of the most gratifying things that I have had since the book came out, it's almost not quite a month since it's been out, is that I'm getting emails from people I don't know, just saying, "I'm in your situation," different phases of it. And I wasn't able to connect with these other books, but I was able to connect with yours. And that I find so gratifying. And I'm thinking, great, this is exactly why I did it. So this is a good thing.
Beautiful. Yeah. My dad died when I was 30, and I read Joan Didion's book first. And you talk about in the book how like the first half of it was really helpful. And then the second half, I just couldn't relate to. And that was disappointing because I love her writing. And I was just like, I want this to be different. But I loved your book throughout the book. And I think one of the distinctions I had not considered and hadn't heard was widower and widow. And so you would be a widower, correct?
Yeah, a male is a widower, a female is a widow. I don't know how that began, why they even differentiated.
I know. I looked up the origin and it wasn't really very illuminating. So I was just like, all right, we'll run with that. But I don't think that a lot of widowers have written books from the perspective that you were bringing. And I think that that made it, for all the reasons that I think it's a really great book, an important book that needed to be written. Most of the books by males I've read on grief are a little bit more zoomed out, not personal stories, more how to move through grief. And like you're saying, like maybe therapeutically something. But what you're pointing to is this top down, coming at it very linear and logically when it is such an emotional experience and your brain is not online for that first year.
Rebecca, you just reminded me, there was a moment of panic that I had. In the old days, I think when people wrote books, they would, type up a transcript and then take all the pages over to the publisher. Nowadays, you just hit a button, right? And so I had it, we had talked, and I hesitated, and I'm thinking, I've never written something like this that is this personal. And do I want to do this? And I had this internal debate going on for a while. And I think I just held my breath and hit the button then.
And then did I send the right draft? Yeah. And you mentioned something about, and they're like short chapters.
Oh,
and
right.
I have a story that maybe that was related to grief and a reason that you had kept them short.
Kept them short because I didn't have that concentration after Lisa died. And it took a long time for my brain to come back. I've heard the expression brain fog after trauma, and other people have said they had the same experience. So I think that's why I kept the chapters short. I didn't want people to get bogged down like I did with all the other books. And getting back to the Joan Didion book, what I said was there were 5 great pages and I copied them and I would read them over, but I could not relate to the rest of the book.
Right.
I think this reflection is really important, that a couple of things, like one, not every book resonates, like not every song, not every movie resonates. But this thing that, and the statistics even that you gave about widowers and widows and just the different way that our world interprets a widower, right? Like it's like a Hallmark movie when you were describing it in the book. I was like, oh goodness, these are like Hallmark movies. Like, oh, the interesting,
the vulnerable.
Captain Von Trapp, who had all these children and need Frau Maria to come in and help her, and to give such a touching and insightful view into the complexities of the whole process of it. And I think it was so important from a male perspective, from a husband's perspective, and the fact that you were able to then touch, reach out to other friends who had lost their wives. That felt like, even though some of them you did it a little bit further down the line, that felt like a really important part of your, we don't talk about grief as healing, but part of your integration of grief into your life as you moved forward. So how was that to be able to talk with other men who had also lost their partners?
It was incredibly helpful. If you recall, I wrote in the book that it was suggested I get into a grief group. I got into the group very, very early on. It was in the first month, and I was a mess. And actually, since then, someone suggested that grief groups might be better after the first year and not right away. There were two reasons it didn't work for me. The first reason was there were 12 people and there was so much pain in that room. And I just felt so awful for everyone because I knew what they were going through. It didn't make me feel better. And I just thought, this isn't working for me. The other reason was there was a difference in the sexes and we were outnumbered. There were 12 people, 10 women, one other guy with me. And even though we were all going through the same experience, the same hurt, the same sorrow, the same loss, what most of the women talked about were things that surprised me and I couldn't relate to. And many of them said they felt endangered because they lost physical protection. And in two cases, the late husbands were policemen. So, that kind of made sense to me. I didn't feel that way. There were so many things I missed about Lisa. Physical protection wasn't one of them. And although I said if either Claire or I had been attacked, she would have fought like a banshee to protect them. With no doubt about that. But it wasn't part of my mind. And what I missed were, it sounds like stupid things, but, Lisa would bring beauty into the house. She brought flowers, she brought lace things, and I never quite understood them. And then, boy, did I miss them when they weren't here.
I actually loved in your book you describing the things that you missed being part of a we, that you missed being part of this couple, that you missed being in her light, that she was this human that sort of could walk in the world and walk into the room, loved beauty. I loved, her Bergdorf, shopping.
Even though I argued about it, I said, why are you spending so much? This happens in couples and we had very different problems. She had no problem spending money and I do. So
you should talk with my husband. Yeah.
Yeah, like you would miss that, that we miss the things that we didn't even realize we would miss.
Andrea, what you just mentioned it was a realization I had one day that after I met Lisa and we were together, I was not on my own anymore. And I had the power she elevated me, I thought. And whether it was just walking down the street, here I was with this, just amazing woman. If we were at a party, if we were sitting together on an airplane, and I used a celestial reference and a metaphor. And I said, I felt like I was the moon reflecting her glow. And boy, oh boy, did she cast a glow in so many ways. And then I realized, oh man, I'm all by myself now. I've got to stand in this world by myself. And I felt like a lesser person. I still do.
Yeah. I thought that was just such an insightful element of it. I think those of us who are sort of partnered off and maybe even have been in a partnership for a while, I think we have a tendency to not look at those things that have become so normal and can only imagine the sort of vacuum if that thing were ever to be gone. So I thought that was just such a beautiful way to talk about it.
Thank you.
And as you're talking about that, when I was reading that part and that chapter and struck with, being in a partnership now that feels like this is my person and that sense of, the book group that I'm leading, we talk about the gates of grief. And the first gate of grief is understanding that everything you love, you will lose. And I hate that truth, and it's a truth. And so when I was listening, I'm like, right, like this too shall pass. This is not, as much as I love this there will be an end. And the reminder that no matter how much you try to prepare for that moment that they pass is so different, the life before and the life after. And you talked about that in your book. And I just wanted to hear you say a little bit about that experience here of like knowing she has cancer, you're preparing, okay, this is what it's going to be like. She is dying, but there's no way to prepare for what grief hits you when that person is gone.
There may be a way to prepare for other people. I couldn't figure that out. I couldn't do it. And I tried. I described it in the book as when you're a kid and you first are introduced to the concept of infinity. Your brain can just go so far and then you stop because you just don't have the bandwidth to go any further. So I would be sitting in the hospital. I would be dealing with everything. And I would think to myself, okay, they're telling me there's a chance she's not going to make it. What's my life going to be like? And I couldn't imagine it. And the things I thought I might be doing were nowhere near, reality, the reality of what did happen. So no, I couldn't really prepare for it. And I was probably in denial too. I just didn't believe it. I did not believe it. Even at the very end, she was in the hospital. I remember the date. It was December 15th. And they said, there's nothing more we can do. And I said, in the most benign language possible of an impending death, they said, we are now at the stage where our only option is to make her as comfortable as possible. Well, you know what that means. But I did not believe it. I just couldn't believe it. I will say I made the right decision there. They gave me two options, to go to a hospice hospital or bring her home. And I knew what I was going to do right from the start. But I went to look at the hospice hospital anyway, which was a lovely place. The people were lovely. Very, very nice. But I brought her home, and I'm very glad I did that. And she was with us for 2 weeks after that.
Yeah, that was a very tender part of the book about those final weeks and being able to see her happiness in being among her things and in her home. And you talked about her sort of drifting in and out of awareness, but still the sort of overarching feel of her being happy to have been at home.
Yes, it was what I would have wanted. I would have wanted to be there. And I said it still hits you, right?
Yeah, it does.
Anyway, it was the right thing to do. And she died in the home we made together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I go back to the movies?
Yes.
Let's go back. Andrea, you talked about, I forgot about Van Trapp. I never used him, but I went and looked at a couple of movies after Lisa died, and I was appalled at most of them. And I also couldn't figure out why. Well, I could. It made box office sense to show the vulnerable, lonely, handsome widower. Mm-hmm. And I didn't see any films with women in that situation. You know, and also the whole community, everybody trying to fix up the guy. And one movie was worse than the next. And there was one film that caught it so perfectly, and it wasn't even intended, I thought. And it was a scene with Gregory Peck playing Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. And he's just sitting on the porch. He's put his kids to bed, but he's overhearing a conversation that the kids are having between themselves. They're in separate rooms. And Scout is asking Jim what he remembered about their mother. And the power of it is that you're just focused on Gregory Peck's face and you're just seeing him hear it.
Amazing.
Yeah. No lines, and yet so many messages in that, right? You can imagine his heart just cracking open and breaking, and also like loving his children so intensely all at the same time.
Yeah. Atticus Finch is, I think, everyone's ideal as the perfect father.
Right. It is a wonderful book. I'm curious, because you did go back and watch these movies. What was the sort of impetus for that? Like, what were you like, you don't know.
I'm not sure. I guess I was trying to see if I could learn something, if something could help me. And they didn't. Well, no, wait, I'm going to take that back. There was a wonderful series with a British comedian, Ricky Gervais,
right?
Called Afterlife. I think that's the name of it, where he's a reporter for a local paper in a small town in England, and he has just lost his wife. And you see the wife coming back in videos, which is something I could relate to because I have a ton of videos of Lisa. Different stages with Claire. You know, she's diapering Claire. She's reading to Claire. They're dancing together. And so I could go back and see these videos, hear her. And that brings up a whole other question that I would like to raise with you. It's like, for most of history, human beings did not even have images of their departed loved ones, unless you were a king or queen and you could have, someone paint a portrait of someone. Kodak brought out the Brownie Instamatic, I think, in the 1920s, and that made photography popular. But that's only the 1920s, a lot of history before that. And I am old enough to remember the Super 8 movies. My dad, he would have to thread a projector. Now I have it in all these videos with sound, and all I do is hit a button on my computer, and I have them all here. So I'm wondering if that distorts our relationship with the departed. I'm not sure.
I loved that question because you posed that question in your book. Like, is it helping me or does it hinder me from moving on? Because it does seem so real. I actually am still unable to listen to my dad's voice. I have his last voicemail. I now never erase any of my husband's voicemails as a result of this, of my dad passing. And I can't watch videos where he's speaking. I can look at pictures, but it's the sound of his voice that just crushes me. I can't do it. And it's because it feels so real. It's just like, you're right there, and I know you're not right there, and my brain can't quite make sense of it yet. So I am curious. I would love to sort of hear all of our thoughts on that, because there's something amazing, right? Like, I remember in the months after he passed away, I remember communicating with a friend who had lost her mom the year before. And I said, every night before I went to bed, I would envision his hands and I would hear his voice in my head. And that was my exercise of like, I'm never going to let you go. And she said to me, Andrea, that's part of memory. Like part of the memory is you will forget little things. And that's part of this process. And it's 4 years on and I don't do it every night anymore. And so I am curious about like, what part of that was my brain's natural attempt to be able to, hang on to things and then slowly let them go, and how if I looked at his hands every day at a picture, maybe that would be more difficult. I don't know. What do you think, Rebecca?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts. I heard a piece of research that I need to find recently that talked about proximity, that the brain struggles to understand that you don't have the proximity to the person anymore. And it's part of why grief takes a while. And I have this question about how pictures or video keep us from being able to integrate that that person isn't here. And similarly, when my dad died, I could not delete the last voicemail. And I used to call his phone just to hear his voice. It stops after a while, and it reminds me of, there were things I kept that I was like, there's no way I'm ever letting go of this. And then there were things that I just didn't, it was like letting go and not listening to the voicemail anymore, or not, being able to. And it reminds me of Megan Devine writing in the book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, how she used a vomit metric. And she was like, if it doesn't make me want to vomit, to imagine getting rid of it, then I can let it go. But if you still feel like I might vomit, don't do it. Hold on to it forever. And she also wisely said, it doesn't matter if it happened 80 years ago or 8 days ago, it just happened, which I think speaks to the way grief lives in our body and how in an instant and in a memory, we can be right back at the initial loss. So yeah, I don't have an answer for if it's helpful or not helpful, but I imagine there being a long time before I could watch a video with voice or of people I love, and that I wouldn't want to let it go. Yeah, Warren, what was your experience and continues to be your experience?
Rebecca, I think what you just reminded me of is the fact that everyone is different and everyone handles this in a different way. I have a friend in the book, he used fingerprints as a metaphor. Everyone has a different fingerprint. No one has the same fingerprint. And I think everyone will deal with this at some point. And there's no uniform, there's no right way, there's no wrong way. Everyone will deal with it. I'll be honest, Lisa has grown distant in the last 6 years. She was so present in the first year. She was in my thoughts constantly. She was everywhere in my home. And what I wrote was, we would talk all day long. She was busy in her office. I was busy in my office, but we would be texting. We would be leaving emails with each other. My favorite part of the day was when Claire got old enough and she would leave the table to go and do her homework. Lisa and I stayed at the table, and we stayed for over an hour. And this was something I had never done with another human being. I could talk with her forever, and it was right from the start. So we would sit there for over an hour just talking. It said that, I forgot the exact quote, the true intercourse between a couple is talking, or the strongest. Maybe that was it, the strongest. And when you don't talk to someone for weeks, and then months, and then years, that's got to have an impact. And she has grown more distant. And then for no reason that I can ascertain, it comes right back. She comes back, and I'm hit with something. And sometimes it makes sense, and sometimes it's a mystery.
Yeah. And I think that sometimes it's the body, even how people will say, oh, something started to feel weird about the day. And then suddenly I remembered this was the day that this happened. And,
yes.
But it's like the body remembers before our brain knows the date on the calendar.
Yeah.
I want to just say, I appreciate so much, Warren. And I felt this throughout your book. You have this really inclusive way of speaking and this inclusive lens that's sort of like, hey, this is what I experienced, but like, there's a million ways you could experience, or this is what I think is good advice, but this may not fit for you. Skip this chapter. It's such a loving way and not like instructive, but I'm just making an offering. And you mentioned that around like acute grief. I will say, as a therapist who runs groups, it's rare that someone in acute grief benefits from a group, because I think that we're in a space where we're reaching for something to comfort, in a space that we can't undo what happened. And you have to move through that first year in a body way that talking doesn't touch. And I usually tell people that when they're like, no, please let me in this group. I say, okay, come. and it may not fit, and that's okay. And you can revisit it after the first year, and pretty unanimously, people are like, yep, not for me, can't do this right now. So just want to offer that to all of our listeners too, yeah.
That's really good advice. And I think it's important. And I now have a question for you, Rebecca. When you do these groups, do you do what I experienced called an intake? You ask questions of the person?
I do, yeah. And
Okay.
What was your experience of the intake?
It kind of surprised me. And I wrote about this, and she asked a couple of questions. Do you walk into a room and forget why you walked in? And I said, all day long. Any problems with sleep? And I said, yeah, I don't sleep. Any changes in weight? And I said, yeah. And she said, up or down? And I said, down. I lost 10 pounds. I would eventually lose like about 30 pounds. People would come up to me and, I was at my high school weight, and they would say, you look great. And I would say, grief diet, you don't want to try it.
No. Yeah.
But then she asked, any suicidal thoughts? And I said, in my entire life, I have never had a suicidal thought. And I feel now, being a single parent, incredibly responsible for my daughter. However, if I got hit by a bus tomorrow and there was a chance I would see Lisa again, that would be fine with me. So, and then she said, that's fine. That's just a passive suicide thought, not an active one, so that you're okay. And I didn't even realize there was a difference. Yeah. I found the intake to be more interesting than the group in some ways.
Certainly. Yeah. I don't ask the same questions. And mostly it's to get a sense of where someone is. And a lot of times it is, how acute is this grief? And then we have a conversation just to help people know that it is hard to sit because you're in a pain that needs witnessing. Also, it's a harder place to hold the witnessing of other people's pain.
Sure.
So that, it makes sense.
Also, what I love about that intake, and this was sort of present throughout the book, was the connection between these things, right? Like the brain fog, which you talked about, like the forgetfulness. And then when you go on to talk about like all the details, the bank, I was like, oh my goodness, I was just talking to somebody. I was on a work trip and we were having breakfast. And I was like, do you all have a beneficiary on your bank account?
Oh, God.
Right. And then somebody said she's older and her husband's older than her. And she said, oh, and then we have a third. Our daughter is our third. And I was like, oh, note to self. But you talking about the sort of forgetfulness, about the weight loss for you, and it could be something else for other people. And I think that isn't something that either family members are prepared for their person who's directly going through the grief to have, or aren't able to really understand kind of what's wrong with them if they're experiencing it. So I just thought that was so helpful. And I think that hearing you talk about the intake now and in the book was just an important thing where people can just ask themselves, like, I think we recognize I'm having trouble sleeping because we shared a bed with our partner, or, there's like this obvious disconnect, but the memory thing and the eating thing, or even forgetting that you should be eating a meal was, really important with my mom.
I'm going to stop here and say, because you just reminded me, everybody listening to this podcast, make sure that you put someone as your beneficiary on every single account, because I didn't do this. I just assumed we had wills where everything would go to Lisa if I died, vice versa. I thought the wills would take care of it. No, they don't. And I could have just folded our accounts together if I had been named a beneficiary. How stupid of me not to do it. I put in a Wall Street Journal op-ed just to tell people, do this. The other thing is, this shocked me. I have told my friends who are all aging baby boomers, have you guys made any plans for burial? And some people don't want to talk about it. And I just said in the book, this is one less thing you have to deal with on that day when you are just inundated with a billion different things and you're grieving so much. Just have one less major decision to make. Decide however you want to do it. And it's up to the individual. Once again, cremated, you want to be buried, but decide it. And if you want to be buried, buy some graves and it'll be done.
Yeah, we've talked about this just a little bit before, because it's also like the interpretations. It becomes my interpretation of what I think should happen to you, which is remarkably different from like my brother, for example. My dad mostly had his arrangements in place and they had bought a burial plot. We knew he wanted to be cremated. Like we sort of knew all these directives, but there's so many little things that it's like in those moments, you're all grieving and you all have your idea of what should happen to that person. And so to have them have made that decision just is something that you can do now to offer people a little bit more space in that time, which is so surreal, right? Like it's just so surreal.
Yeah, I'll add to that conversation. My dad actually didn't have anything in place, and there's an industry that wants to profit off of your vulnerability. And we sat in a room. He knew where he wanted to be buried, but there were all these extra pieces. And there was the woman who was a salesperson. She was not a grief counselor, and she was trying to get us to buy plots next to him at the time that we're trying to wrap our brains around losing our dad. And my cousin luckily was in the room with us, and she said, they don't need to be sold to right now. Let's stay on track. This is what we're doing. But it made me aware of what a kindness it is to the people you love to have arranged all of that before, because it can be such a predatory space too.
That is exactly what I wrote. You are doing this out of love for your family. You don't want your kids to get into arguments over everything. Have the directive, this is how I want it, and just do it this way. And it'll be so much easier for everyone.
Absolutely.
You remind me of one other thing. In those situations, it's always said it's very good to go with a friend, someone who is close, but not that close that they are impacted in the same way that you are.
Oh my gosh, that's so smart to have somebody who is sort of your ally, deeply cares about you, but is not in the fog of grief and, all the different things that come with it, like a guilt, depending on how the death happened, a guilt or how if somebody says like, don't you want them in a satin-lined casket? Well, okay, of course I do. If that sounds better, then I don't really care. I was luckily the one who was like, I don't care about any of this, but I was really hard for my mom,
Sure.
Well, I'm thinking about your daughter. And as a daughter, there were these moments she got right into my heart. And the place where you said the first part where I just broke down was, I will be writing this eulogy for the rest of my life. Yeah. And just wow. That she even had the strength to say a eulogy. I mean, it's a rough space. Yeah. And then that you had her read. I listened to the audio, and to listen to her describing her experience and just all of it. As soon as she wrapped that piece up, I just was like, I need a moment. I just cried for 20 minutes, So it was really touching that you included her and you had her actually read her part.
We were always a very tight little unit of three. And then we didn't realize, I remember that first night we were just by ourselves together. And there was this huge void. And losing a third of this group is a pretty big number. But we were always very close. It was a really good division of labor. I mean, we adored this kid from the very start. But her mother was really good at certain things that I wasn't good at. And I did things that Lisa didn't do. After Lisa died, I will say that Claire and Claire has said this, we have grown very, very close. And I wrote about this when she asked me this incredible question. Do you remember that part where we were on vacation? It was actually a piece in the Wall Street Journal that I wrote. We were sitting at dinner. It was about a year and a half after Lisa died. We were on vacation. We were able to relax. And she turns to me and she says, did you meet the goals you set for yourself when you were my age? And I thought, whoa, what a question that is. And I had to think about it overnight. And then the next morning when I saw her for breakfast, I said, I am shocked. I am totally shocked by what I came up with. First, I had to remember what I even wanted when I was 21. And I think I was just thinking, what kind of job would I have? Would I be rich? Would I be famous? I have no idea what I thought fame was when I was 21. And I said, what shocked me was that the most important things that I now would place on my accomplishments have nothing to do with my career. And they are standing by your mother during her illness, being a faithful husband, I hope a good father. Those are the most important things in my life. And then people can write comments on different Wall Street Journal pieces, and in a lot of papers, I guess you can do this. And this resonated with other people as well. And they said, the greatest titles in the world, father, mother, husband, wife.
That was such a touching exchange in the book. And it reminded me of when my dad passed, I just sort of my world tipped on its head. My family had always aged into their 90s. So 70 was like, what? This felt so young and so naive and thinking that you were guaranteed time. And, I thought about the things that my dad loved most, even if we didn't get to have that conversation that you had with Claire. And I knew it was family. I knew it was service to people, and I knew it was family. And those were the most important things to him. And I had this moment of like, what am I doing? And how do I ensure that I'm acting out of that value, out of those things that are important to me on the day to day, my little boys, my husband, my family, my friends. So it was such a beautiful exchange. That really touched my heart.
Thank you.
And before we leave Claire, I have to second Rebecca. So when she reads a piece that she wrote at the end, I felt a sense of pride for you, for her. I felt this like deep
She's
secondary
such a good writer.
pride. Yes, this deep secondary pride of like, oh my goodness. Like we all, my boys are 6. So people are like, oh, they look like you, or nobody says that, or they act like you, or whatever it is. But this was like, oh my gosh, your power with words and your ability to write, and then to hear her write this really powerful piece. It just must have, I wonder, for me, it felt like such a bond and connection between the two of you. I felt a deep sense of pride.
I have something around that to tell you. I knew how Lisa's loss affected me. I didn't really understand how it affected Claire. And even though we were talking about the same person, losing a mother, losing a wife, different. And this happened about 4 months after Lisa died. She shared this essay she wrote for a college class. And I was stunned by it. I was just stunned by it. And I thought it was a beautiful piece of writing. And it told me so much about her relationship with her mother and how her mother's illness and death impacted her in a beautiful way. So then I asked her if it just made complete sense if I could put it into the book. And she said, yes, you may. But she thought about it for about 2 days until she came back. Some friends had a party for us when the book came out. And it was such pride that Claire was standing next to me when I spoke, and I read a passage. But I started by saying, it's been said that good writers borrow from other writers, great writers steal. I did something in between. And I put a much better piece of writing at the end, not written by me, but written by Claire. And I believe that. And yes, it is with such pride that I do that. I kind of wanted her to go into her mother's profession, but she seemed to have a talent for writing.
Education is a beautiful combination of helping and utilizing her beautiful skill with words.
She's got her mother's eyes, and she's got those gorgeous blue eyes. Yeah.
Those blue eyes. I love that's amazing. So one of the other things that I think was an important theme in this, and as the daughter of a widow, it was important for me to read these conversations and exchanges and these thoughts about finding a new partner, about finding new love, about, and you talked to several different friends and their journeys, for some were 6 months and for others, have been longer, but an openness to find that. And I loved the permission that she gave you, right?
Yeah.
I have done that with my husband. Mostly it's out of concern that my family survives. I love him. He's very capable. He's very capable, but sometimes I'm like, I'm not sure you know quite everything I do. So I always tell him, boys need a mom. Boys will always need a mother. But I loved that. So I'm curious if you want to talk just a little bit about that sort of exploration of love after you lose your partner. Or the possibility. I don't know where you are in your 6-year journey, but I do know it sounds like at least open to the possibility.
Yeah. Let me explain what you were referring to.
Please.
Lisa lost her mother when she was 12, and it was a traumatic experience because her father, the best thing I can say is he was probably the least likely candidate to have 3 children on his own. The mother seemed to, from what I understood, hold the family together in a lot of ways. So Lisa couldn't deal with her illness. We should tell the listeners that Lisa was a physician and she was a really smart clinician. And I think she understood things about her illness. She was, because of her position, she had some of the leading doctors that dealt with her illness. And she knew as much as they did. I think at times she wasn't the easiest patient, but she couldn't deal with her impending death. She could not deal with it. And I think her biggest fear was leaving Claire the way she had been left. But once in a while, she would say things. And we were sitting in the hospital one day, and I would be on my computer, maybe doing some work for the office, and she would be reading, or it became harder for her to read. So she had an iPad she would be looking at, and then she would just say things out of the blue. And she one day said, it's said that if you've had a good marriage, it will be easier to go into another relationship. I knew exactly what she was saying. She was giving me permission to move on after she was gone. Then I was the one that couldn't deal with it. And I said that. I said, I'm not going to discuss it. Like a second later, I thought that was really wrong to shut her down. She was offering me something in the most gracious way. So I turned it around and I said, okay, if something happens to me, would I want you going into a convent? No, that wouldn't be right, especially since we're Jewish, but.
Right, really complicated.
But then I said, I guess it would be okay, but you absolutely cannot have sex with anyone in the boathouse out of the lake in Wisconsin. That is my turf, and you even try that, I will come down and throw lightning bolts at you. And that got her to laugh, and that made me feel better. So yeah, she was able to do that, and I will always appreciate it. As far as where I am, I'm still not sure. It's been more difficult for me, and I wish it hadn't been. I mentioned I have two friends that lost their wives the same year that Lisa died. Lisa died in January. One of them lost his wife in July, the other in August. My friend in July was dropping off some stuff of his wife's and met someone a month later, and then they hooked up, I guess would be the term. They got together and they are married. And he was, both of them, great husbands, devoted husbands, stood by their wives throughout their illnesses. And I have nothing but happiness for them. The other guy was fixed up with someone a year after his wife died, and they had long conversations, and they're married. In both cases, they sold their house. Oh, here's something. I don't know if this is off topic or not, but right after Lisa died, I travel a lot for work, and I ran into someone who had lost his wife. He had 4 younger kids. And he gave me his advice. He said, sell your apartment, sell all your furniture, buy everything new. He said, otherwise, you're going to make your home into a museum to your late wife. And I thought, whoa, I like where I live. I have wonderful memories. And I didn't do that. And I am so grateful that I didn't do that. It was really hard right after she died to come home. The silence, the emptiness in the house almost physically hurt. But that eased up. And now I come back to my apartment and I am so grateful to be home. It's my fortress of solitude. And it also has such fabulous memories. This is where I brought Lisa after our 3rd date. Maybe we shouldn't put that in. And it is where, we came after our wedding, before we went off on our honeymoon, where we brought Claire home from the hospital, where we raised our little family together. So I love this place, and I'm glad I'm still here.
That's beautiful. I will say, though, one of your friends did call you out on a museum in your bedroom. Another beautiful use of humor throughout your book. But yes, tell us about it.
People are saying they laughed. Look, it's life, and funny things happen and ironic things happen. And I put those in the book too. Okay. And there was this fabulous lady who I adore, who I describe as Mary Poppins. She would come in and just sunshine would exude from her. And she came in to help me. She's a decorator and a really good one. And she was telling me to do this. And I needed to change the bedroom because that's where Lisa died. And when she walked in, she saw what I had done without even thinking. I put up all of these photos of Lisa throughout the room in frames of Lisa with me, Lisa with Claire, the 3 of us. And she walks in and she looks around and she says, Warren, do you have albums? I said, of course I have albums. And then she waves her arms. She said, take all these pictures and put them in albums. And then she paused and she said, otherwise you're never going to get laid again. It gave me a laugh, and I appreciated that. And in many cases, the stories I relate just made me laugh, and that made me happy. There's one other thing. You didn't ask this question, but it's something that has stayed with me, and it is about 5 years after Lisa died. I was walking down, I still remember the block. I was walking down Madison Avenue, and it was just this gorgeous fall day, one of those perfect October days. And even the people walking towards me were smiling. You don't see that in New York. And I had my AirPods in, and I was listening to a gorgeous piece of music. And I all of a sudden realized, oh my God, I'm happy.
Oh,
Nothing special happened. I didn't win a lottery. I didn't meet a new love. I was just walking down the street on a beautiful day, and I was happy to be alive. And I didn't know if I would ever feel that way again.
yeah.
So sweet. Thank you for including that. That's what I think is so hard in our grief is like someone can say, you will feel that. And it's just like you can't find the truth of that until you experience it.
Yeah. And I didn't think I ever would.
Yeah.
I didn't think that would happen again. Just a beautiful day.
Yeah. In the check-in, Rebecca, you were talking about the chapter that you did with your group about ritual. And Warren, in your book, your faith is woven in. And like Rebecca said, you do it in this way of like, this is me and this is mine. It's not proselytizing. It's not saying something is better than something else. It was part of your world before, during, and after. But there were several things in it about sort of the rituals around death and dying. And I was sort of curious if you wanted just to share a little bit about that. I was thinking in particular Shiva, and then I apologize that I don't know the name for it, but when you would go to the synagogue and say a certain prayer.
The reason I was overly cautious about raising the topic of religion was because it is such a touchy subject right now. And as I said, if my own friends are a microcosm of what is in the world, they span the spectrum. I have friends that go to church and synagogue daily. I have friends that have never set foot in a church or synagogue. And I know for me, everyone's religion is their own personal choice. I would never in a million years tell someone how to believe, nor would I tell them what their politics should be. Having said that, at the end of the book, I realized there's no way I could write about grief and death without mentioning religion because the two are completely intertwined. And I almost wonder if religion wasn't created in the first place to help people deal with death, this mystery that people have been dealing with since the beginning. For me, it was a huge help. And there is something in the Jewish religion called the Shiva. Shiva is the Hebrew word for 7. And for 7 days after the funeral, people come to the house. And the way I described it was people just kept coming in, work colleagues, neighbors, the guys from the gym, people you want to see, people you don't want to see. But it forces you to be human at a time you would just rather go into your bedroom and put the blanket over your head and not see anyone. Every religion, every culture has a variant of this. There are wakes for Catholics. Everyone does this, and there's a reason for it. And I found that the reason was that it forces that person, the person who is grieving, to take those first steps back into life. Even though you don't want to, it forces you to. And I had to be social. I had to thank people for coming. I had to have some conversation with them. It forced me to be human when I didn't think I could be human. And I had gone through Shivas for my grandparents, my parents, and I never understood the importance of it until then. So that was very important. The other part you refer to, Andrea, is that I go to a small, they call them shtibels, a small little synagogue. And in every Jewish religious service, there is something called the Amidah. It's the silent prayer. And if you're a Christian and you've gone to a synagogue service for the first time, you might be a little shocked. It seems like it's more like a town meeting. There's all sorts of stuff going on. And it's a communal service. And with the Amidah, it's the one moment that there's complete silence. And everyone stands and you do a personal prayer to yourself couldn't go for a few minutes. And I used that, I described it as that was when I would talk to Lisa. And I would imagine, I don't know if you guys are old enough, you might not remember this, what it was like when you put a dime in a payphone and you hear the clink, clink, and then the connection. Yeah. And I would imagine the coin going into the payphone and connecting with her. And I would tell her everything on my mind. And I could really have a conversation with her. And it became my favorite part of the service. And then when I mentioned this, I have been seeing a therapist, and the therapist has been incredibly helpful. And he said, does she ever talk back? And I said, nope, it's a pretty one-way conversation. But it was a reasonable question.
Very reasonable. And there's actually someone created a payphone that you can go and speak. You would maybe put a coin in, I think, but you speak to your loved ones on the other side. I mean, no one's talking back, but it's such a sweet offering to people.
I didn't know that. Yeah,
it was interesting that analogy came up for you.
Yeah, and I can't even figure out where it came from, but I thought that was a way of connecting. That's the old word, connecting. You would connect through an operator or something.
Makes sense. Yeah. Thank you
Beautiful.
for sharing that.
Yeah, that felt an important point that I wanted to touch on because it was so beautifully woven into your journey and throughout the book. So thank you.
So I'm noticing the time, and I think we will start to wrap this conversation up, but it's been absolutely amazing, lovely, soul-filling to have this conversation with you, Warren. And the way that we check out is Andrea and I will check in with how we've been checking into our grief this week. And we'll invite you to answer that question if you have an answer as well.
I will go back to your original question, where is my heart? And my heart is in a much better place having the opportunity to talk to you, Rebecca, and you, Andrea. This has been just delightful. As you said, I feel like we could go on. But thank you also for all the incredible work that you both do, helping others.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Rebecca, how have you been touching into your grief this week?
I read this great book called Waving Goodbye. And it's real. It's true. Yes,
I have it here.
Beautiful. Yes. And we'll include links to all of your things in our show notes. But yeah, it's just the way that words, it's always so amazing to me and is analogous to the group experience. But the way that I can read someone's words and feel right back in the memory of my grief. And I think every grief is different. I think even when you have the same grief, you can't say, I know what you feel, because you don't know what someone feels, but you know what grief feels like. I was so moved by this book and found myself just having to pause and cry and like integrate pieces of it, laughed, but it did bring me a lot back into losing my dad. And it's been a while since I've been in that grief, and it's not unwelcome. It just, you go through life and you're like, this is what's present. And it made my dad present to me again in a way that feels really sweet. So that's how I've been in my grief this week. What about you, Andrea?
I mean, it sounds like we're just doing a plug, which we kind of all, but also it was listening to the book, and I'm so excited we're getting physical copies in our hands too, so that I can flip through it and highlight and dog ear pages. And, as I mentioned when we came on, like, I know it's the season of losing my dad, but I didn't know when. And so to be listening to this book, and then yesterday was the day, and it actually helped me just think about the experience of my mom being the widow and how inevitably that was going to be different from her children's loss to her loss. And it was just a powerful connector. I feel connected to you, Warren. I feel connected to Claire and Lisa. I feel connected to my mom. I thought of you, Rebecca, who lost your dad. Like, it was just such a beautiful sort of triangulation of humans that I love. So Warren, again, thank you so much for putting this out there. It is a departure from what you're used to writing, and it was so needed in the world. And I hope more and more people find it in their hands. And so we extend our love to you and to Claire, and just thank you for coming on our podcast.
Thank you for having me. You made my day.
Oh, Warren, well, we hope it's a wonderful one. And it's Friday, and I hope it's like just the perfect weather in New York.
A nice day.
All right, you too.
Be well. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Warren.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of All the Grief. You can find us on Instagram at All the Grief Pod. And please take a moment to rate our podcast and share us with your friends. We'd love to keep expanding our reach to all the people who could benefit from conversations on grief. Take care.